Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be sharing another journal entry that I wrote, and it's on a subject that's really important for a lot of us to think about. I talk a lot about us recognizing that it's not our fault that our mothers treated us the way that they did. It's not our fault that it damaged us in the way that it did. And yet at the same time, I don't want us to take that information, which is true, and to just lay down and be victims. It's not our fault that we developed these problems, but it is in our power now to recognize the ways that the abuse of our mothers affected us and to take action to heal so we can make our lives better and move toward the futures that we want. I think it's okay to have a period of time where you grieve and feel very angry at the years that were stolen from us. It's absolutely okay to have a period of time where maybe you're not ready to work on yourself and you just need to feel that anger or even rage. That's a normal phase of grief, and this is something to be grieved. When I look at the things other people have had in their lives, the friendships and the relationships, and just not having all these struggles, it does make me angry that my mother did this to me. But it's also important that we eventually reach a place where that anger becomes something that we can live with, that doesn't drive our behavior or prevent us from healing and getting better. Today I'm going to be sharing a journal entry I wrote about my attachment style. So when you're a scapegoat child, when you're raised by a narcissist, and actually I would say even a lot of golden children experience this too, because the reality is, even though our mothers treated our golden child siblings so much better than they treated us, those of us who are scapegoats, that doesn't change the fact that our mothers were not able to be emotionally available to their golden children. Now, it might look like they were, because they were so much kinder to them, they expressed so much more interest in them as people, and yet when the really hard times came, the reality is our mothers are not able to show the kind of affection, care, and empathy that all of us need, golden children or scapegoat children. The one piece of good news for us scapegoat children, though, is that because things were so much worse in other ways as well with our mothers, it's inevitable that at some point we see there's a serious problem, and we're so much more likely to figure out what that problem is, which is that our mother is a narcissist. And that puts us in a position to heal and to do better. So many golden children, their relationships with their mothers are so confusing because their mothers aren't awful to them all the time. And so even though they too had a pretty much emotionally absent mother, it's just harder for them to see. So if you're a scapegoat child like me, yes, we can come to see something is deeply wrong with our mothers, but it's also important that we recognize the ways that that affected us and the problems that we're dealing with that affect our relationships even today. And one of the greatest ways being a scapegoat child or the child of a narcissist in general can affect us is by affecting the way that we attach to other people. When you have a healthy mother, she's there for you, she's a source of comfort, and that provides a setting to attach to people in general with the expectation of having good treatment from them, of having healthy interactions where you show care for one another. Those early relationships with our parents are so important for us to be able to properly and healthfully attach to other people. Unfortunately for us, we didn't get to have that. When I came to my mother for comfort, I was rejected. I was treated without care. And as a child, when you do that again and again and again and again, eventually that pushes that child to develop a very unhealthy attachment style. And then when we become adults, we continue those unhealthy practices based on an unhealthy attachment style in all of our relationships. it can be difficult or uncomfortable sometimes to see these issues that we have. And the reason for that is, I think, just being criticized so much by our mothers. We tend to be kind of sensitive to that. And also because we are recognizing it's not our fault, we don't want to feel a sense of blame. Like, oh, it's my attachment style that's affecting my relationships. Because being blamed is very hard for us. We've been blamed for everything, for all kinds of things that were not our fault, that had nothing to do with us. But understand, coming to recognize you have an unhealthy attachment style isn't blaming yourself. I think when we try to look at ourselves in a critical way, to evaluate what we need to work on, it's hard to not hear those terms coming from the voices of our mothers. Like, oh, look at you and your unhealthy attachment style. But that's not the way to approach it. You and I have suffered an extremely damaging form of psychological abuse for decades. And it would be weird to go through that and not be profoundly affected by it. And so you don't need to feel guilt or shame or blame to admit these things to yourself. Just recognize them, and that will empower you to do and be better. Try not to be afraid. So as you explore this area of yourself, it might make you feel a little afraid, or maybe even very afraid, very uncomfortable. But push yourself to move through that. In general, people like us will tend to form one of two attachment styles. One is an anxious attachment style. And if you find yourself, if you have a partner or a friend and you're texting them a lot, you're calling them a lot, like you just need a lot of reassurance that they care, that tends to be driven by an anxious attachment style. We'll talk more about that in another episode. That's not the reaction I personally had. What I did instead was I developed an avoidant attachment style. An avoidant attachment style is a very common reaction to being raised by a parent who was emotionally unavailable and rejecting during our childhoods. And if your mother was a narcissist, it's inevitable that that's how she was. Since your needs were never regularly or predictably met by her, you were pretty much forced to distance yourself emotionally and to learn to self-soothe. You didn't have any other choice, and somehow you had to be able to survive that. You learned to suppress any outward displays of emotion and to avoid seeking closeness with your mother because it always ended up with you being in more pain than you were before. So going to somebody for help, displaying your emotions, just ended up with you feeling worse. And so over time, you just sort of tucked all that away and stopped doing it. And this builds a foundation of avoiding intimacy and just desiring independence later in life. You wall yourself off from intimacy, even when that sense of independence and lack of intimacy can cause its own distress. Because even if you're afraid of close, meaningful, intimate relationships, you also deeply long for them. In my journal entry, I was honest with myself, and I'm going to be honest with you about things I've struggled with that have damaged relationships in my life. I replied to 5 statements that tend to be true of people with avoidant attachment styles. And know that even if you do have this attachment style, it's in our power to change. I see it as my mother, for the abuse that she suffered, she succumbed to that. She developed narcissism, and there's no way she's ever going to get better. But I didn't let that happen to me. The abuse I suffered has caused me problems, but I'm growing as a person, I'm changing, I'm healing, and I'm getting better. And I'd like to share my journal entry with you now. 1. I feel I'm an independent person, content to care for myself. I remember as a teenager, I used to say I didn't want to ever get married. I didn't want to date. I didn't want anything to do with it. In high school, everyone was dating and talking about boys or talking about girls, and I wondered why they were so obsessed with it. I did try to date someone a couple times in my teens. Very quickly, though, the relationship fell apart. I felt so overwhelmed, completely, utterly overwhelmed. I was supposed to be with this person a lot. When in groups, I was supposed to be with this specific person most of the time, and the thought of that was suffocating. When the relationship would become physical in any way, even just holding hands or a kiss, it was paralyzing. Neither of those two relationships lasted more than 2 weeks. I just couldn't bear it. I didn't understand why I was feeling those things, but it was absolutely suffocating. When I was 20 years old, I attempted to date for the third time, and the same fears quickly began to choke me. I didn't actually see it as fear, though. Now that I think about it, I would say it was uncomfortable. It was awkward. I would freeze up. But now I understand. I was afraid. I thought it was because my mom set such a horrible example for me with all of this. My mother could not show me affection in any way. If she did hug me, which was usually for show when people are around, or anyone in the family for that matter, she'd be joking about it and laughing like, "Oh, let's hug," in efforts to ease her own discomfort. But that made it only all the more uncomfortable for me. And I'm sure it's true that that is a reason I've struggled with showing affection to others. But I understand now that there was more to it than that. All the years as a child that I turned to my mother for comfort during a difficult time, I was rejected. I experienced tremendous pain from doing that. She never responded with actual care or comfort. I'd be insulted instead, or just outright ignored. When I was 9, I had a terrible earache that wouldn't go away. I told my mom, and told my mom, and told my mom. She kept talking to me like I was a big baby. "Oh, quit whining about it," she'd say. And she'd get angry at me every time I told her how badly my ear was hurting. One night, I awoke to terrible, piercing pain deep in my ear. I sat up to find there was blood on my pillow. I went to my mother, showing her the blood coming out of my ear. I was terrified. She did take me to the emergency room, but showed no compassion for the amount of pain I was in. It turned out I'd had a terrible ear infection, and because it wasn't treated, my eardrum had ruptured. My mom never apologized for not listening to me. And while she did do what was physically needed to take care of my ear after that, giving medications and such, I remember laying on the couch quite often in so much pain as I recovered. And she never sat with me to comfort me or to help, just rub my back, or she just never expressed like any care. And that's how it always was. It just didn't matter how much pain I was in, physically or emotionally. She never showed any real signs of care. No sitting with me to provide comfort. Ever. Never were there soothing words. She wasn't capable of these things. All that rejection I experienced time after time after time, it made me paralyzingly fearful of rejection, of being vulnerable. Because as I was growing up, making myself vulnerable by showing my emotions led to me being hurt many, many times. So eventually, I just stopped seeking it out and built a wall around myself to prevent that rejection from happening again. And while I didn't understand all of this back then, as I began to date for the third time, those terrible feelings of what I thought was awkwardness returned. I was afraid. But by then, I realized I didn't want to be this way, but I didn't know how to stop. Holding hands, sharing a kiss, saying I love you, and showing affection or being shown affection, I wanted that, and yet I was frightened of it. So I talked to him about it. That, too, was very difficult. But it helped that we'd been friends in high school, so he wasn't a new person to me. Of course, I was unable to explain why I had these difficulties. I didn't even understand it myself back then. But I explained it as best as I was able. And I got lucky. He listened, and he was patient with me while I worked through those fears, and that helped me tear down some of those walls at a pretty young age. Definitely not all of those walls. I'm still working on the rest. But some of those walls came down. That relationship lasted about a year. We were both very unhealthy people at the time, so the relationship was doomed to fail. Although a few years later, we began our friendship again, and we're still friends to this day. Beyond helping me tear down those walls, that relationship helped me see that I didn't really want to be alone after all. I did want intimacy. I was just not able for a long time to have it. Unfortunately, because my mother is a narcissist, my next relationship would be with a narcissist, so I'd use those skills I'd built on the wrong person, and I've had many relationships with narcissists since I was unable to see the red flags, given that my mother's behavior had been so normalized to me. That has led me to be deeply hurt by multiple people, not just in dating relationships, but in many friendships, which has only contributed to my fears of close relationships. 2. As someone tries to get closer to me, I tend to withdraw. Speaking of having relationships with narcissists, reflecting back on the friendships and dating relationships I've had over the years, weirdly, the narcissists I befriended or dated were the ones I connected to quickly. They knew how to manipulate me and make me feel very comfortable. And I suppose that their behavior was so normal to me, it just seemed like a fit. Anytime I meet someone who seems to have it together, like they're clearly a healthy person, I can see now that I would withdraw from them as the relationship grew closer. I've basically ghosted people, just feeling so sure I was a bother to them and being so afraid of admitting I wanted a friendship with them because I was just sure they wouldn't want the same with me. So I'd reject them before they had the chance to reject me. I didn't realize that I did this until I was in therapy. My therapist helped me see how fear-driven I am in my interactions with other people. It's so hard for me to believe that a normal, healthy person would want to have a friendship or a relationship with me. I still struggle with these feelings, and I do still have a strong tendency to keep my distance from people. But I'm working to push past those fears and allow myself to be vulnerable. I know this will take time, but I'm recognizing my tendency to withdraw as relationships grow closer, and I'm not allowing that to dictate my behavior anymore. 3. I'm uncomfortable with my emotions, and I'm uncomfortable displaying emotions. I'm definitely uncomfortable showing my feelings. However, the relationship I mentioned earlier did help me with that a lot. I'm so glad I didn't have my son until I was older, because when I was younger, I don't think I would have been a very good mother. I was too unable when I was younger to show affection or love in an intimate way. Even hugging someone felt uncomfortable. But that relationship I wrote about earlier helped me break through some of those barriers. I do still struggle with displaying my emotions in many settings, but I'm thankful I don't have that issue with my son. I do think I would have struggled with that 20 years ago. Expressing when I'm really sad about something is hard for me. That vulnerability in a friendship is difficult. It's challenging to not be fearful that the person won't care or will feel bothered by me talking about my feelings about something I've experienced. But I'm pushing past those fears too, now that I better understand their root. Anger used to be the only emotion I could display freely. But I'm learning to show my sadness, worries, grief, and other emotions like that. And I can see that improving and getting better. I've even shared with some friends and my brother about these fears I'm dealing with and working to overcome. And sharing about that fear was absolutely terrifying to do. But I did it. This is also helping me see who my real friends are. Those who don't really care, maybe they just weren't that great of friends to begin with. After all, I've had many friendships with unhealthy people who don't express care just as I once was unable to. I've been hurt at times when sharing these feelings. In fact, I recently came to see that a friendship that was really important to me wasn't what I thought it was. But the signs were there all along, I can now see. I just missed them. I'm going to call her Alexandria. A friend of mine passed away last June, someone really important to me. I was at Alexandria's house when I received the news that my friend had been diagnosed with cancer. He had declined very rapidly and was going into hospice care, and he wasn't even lucid anymore. I was shocked and devastated. I couldn't even say goodbye, and I was so overwhelmed with grief. As I began to talk about it with her, her response was a cold, distant, "Well, death is a part of life." When he died a couple days later, I told her about it as I fought tears. And she replied, cold once again, "Well, what's the point? He wasn't even awake, so it's not like it's worse that he's gone now." There was no affection. There was no empathy. She, too, has an inability to express these emotions. Her mother died a couple years ago, and when I tried to express my care toward her in her time of pain, she pushed away. "Death is a part of life," she said. She couldn't even express her sadness about her own mother's death, and because of that, she developed extreme anxiety that eventually pushed her to shut out almost everyone from her life. Those were all huge red flags that this was not a relationship with someone I could trust with my feelings. But I just kept waiting for her to be doing better, not seeing that this was not a temporary problem. And recently, she did some other things that made it clear to me that she wasn't the friend I thought she was. Scapegoat children of narcissists are so prone to this happening. We're so used to feeling not cared about that when people don't show us care in a situation, it's easy for us to just forget about it and cling to the tiny bit of good in that relationship. We had to do this to emotionally and mentally survive a childhood with our mothers. But as adults, it's such a habit. We do it in other relationships too. And we set ourselves up to be hurt again and again and again. I've pulled away from Alexandria. I don't intend to reach out to her again. She really hurt my feelings recently and doesn't even care that she did. And that hurts. I've woke up at night thinking about it because I'm so hurt. And how many times I have been in this exact situation. But I'm determined to not allow that to increase my fears of rejection. I can now see what happened. I missed the signs that she was sending, the lack of empathy. I mean, she did do nice things for me, and because of those nice things, I was unable to see the harshness she surrounds herself with. She has her own walls, but she isn't trying to tear them down. I know it will take time to be better able to assess whether a relationship is healthy and whether I can trust someone with my feelings as I get to know them. But I'm still going to keep trying. 4. I tend to minimize the feelings of those I'm in a relationship with. This one is hard for me to admit, but I have been very guilty of this. My mom never showed any care for my feelings, so I didn't know how to show my care for others' feelings. Many years ago, though, I had a revelation. This was long before I knew my mother was a narcissist, but I'd recognized she had a lot of problems, at least. My brother was visiting me, and he was getting something out of the trunk of my car. I thought he was done, but he realized he needed one more thing. He reached back in, but by then, I'd already started to close the trunk of the car, and I accidentally hit his head. It really hurt, and he grabbed his head and expressed so much pain. And my first instinct was to brush it off, or even blame him for putting his head there. But I caught myself. It was the first time I realized I treated others the way my mother treated me. Had she done that to me, she would have yelled at me and blamed the mistake on me, even while I stood there grabbing my head in pain. In that instant, I refused to be anything like her, and I apologized and asked if he was okay. I'm so glad I had this realization way back then. That was over 20 years ago. But it's taken time to overcome that tendency to dismiss the feelings of others and to know what to do in its place. I've made huge improvements since then, but I still have had a ways to go. But now that I understand what is going on with my mother, and how and why her being a narcissist has influenced me in these ways, I've felt much more empowered to work on this more effectively. When you know what the problem is, you become more able to fix it. I've become a better listener, and I'm still working on those skills. I've learned to validate others' feelings rather than questioning them or trying to give advice. My son was born with a lot of medical issues, and he was in the hospital much of the first year of his life. It was really hard, obviously. I learned through that how powerful it is to just be with someone in their sorrow. I don't have to fix everything for them. I don't have to advise them. To just be with someone and together shake our fists at the sky, that is a powerful act of love and care when someone is in need. And I've learned a lot about this from those experiences, and that's enabled me and empowered me to be that for others. I refuse to allow my past rejections to make me the kind of person that dismisses the feelings of others or to show little care for them. I'm better than that. 5. I tend to act like I don't want close personal relationships, but deep down, I long for them. I do want personal relationships that are close and meaningful. It's been such a struggle to pursue those desires for so much of my life. But I feel like now that I'm 3 years of no contact with my mother, and since I've gone to therapy and better understand myself, I'm in a position now to have better relationships in my life. It will take time, and I'm going to make mistakes. My recent occurrence with Alexandria has shown me that. But I'm allowing myself to feel that sadness and hurt so I can process it. I'm not convincing myself that it doesn't matter and I'm just fine without her. That's how I used to deal with these feelings. The truth is, I wanted a better relationship with her, and I thought we had one. I made a mistake. I missed her red flags that the relationship would never be what I desired. I'm going to actually grieve that instead of acting like it doesn't matter. It's hard to do that. The pain of that hits me harder because I've felt this from my own mother so many times for so many years. Allowing myself to truly feel and process that grief is exceptionally painful. It's very triggering of my past traumas. But it's important. I can see as I write this that not only have I had a habit of withdrawing from others in the past, I withdraw from my own self. When pain occurs that reminds me of the pain I experienced from my mother, I tell myself things that aren't true, that it doesn't really matter, that, well, they've shown their true colors, so this isn't actually a loss. But it was a loss. Even though I made a mistake and failed to see those signs, what I thought we had in our friendship, it does matter that it didn't work out that way. And yes, she did show her true colors, but it is still a loss. And I'm going to be true to myself this time and let myself just feel it. I'll work through it. I'll process it. And I'll actually learn from my mistakes so I can become better. I'll heal. And I will continue to take these risks. I'll be more wise in the future, better watching for those signs. I still may fail and trust someone I shouldn't have. Knowing this, that fear is very present, but I'm not going to allow fear to drive my behaviors and patterns anymore. I'm going to push past them. And while there is risk involved, there is also great reward. I have become closer to a friend I've made in the past couple years. Her mother is also a narcissist, and we talk to each other about the issues we struggle with. We can talk about them openly and honestly, and sometimes we even laugh at ourselves together, recognizing how irrational some things about us are, and yet here we are, both doing them. Sometimes it can help to laugh. It makes the load lighter. I don't need to feel shame for the problems and the relationships in my life that have resulted from everything I experienced with my mother. But I'm not going to lay down and be a victim. It's now in my power to change these aspects of myself even more. And I believe the best and happiest times of my life are waiting for me. Thanks for listening. Remember that all these issues you're dealing with, they're not your fault that you developed them. But the power is in your hands to heal and to improve and to get better. I'll see you next week. And please remember, to all my fellow survivors, you are worthy, you are valuable, and you are beautiful, whether your mom sees that or not.